There are moments that define a child's entire existence. Moments where his brain creates neural pathways that will determine how he loves, how he trusts, how he believes in his own worth for the rest of his life. Neuroscientists call them critical attachment moments. Psychologists call them formative trauma events. Parents call them the day everything changed. This is the story of one such moment, and the man who changed its trajectory. 5-year-old Marcus Mercer stood at his bedroom window in their penthouse apartment overlooking the Atlantic, watching ships move in and out of the harbor like toys in a bathtub. His mother had taught him to identify them by their flags, their shapes, their purposes. That one carried automobiles from Germany. That one brought electronics from China. That one transported coffee from Colombia. Though his mother had been careful to explain, it also carried other things that Marcus wouldn't understand until he was older. "Why don't I have a daddy?" he asked without turning around. Isolde Mercer was reviewing shipping manifests at her desk, but she heard the question clearly. She had been expecting it. Marcus asked this question every few months, each time with a slightly different inflection, as though he was testing whether the answer might have changed since the last time. She set down her pen and walked to him, kneeling so they were at eye level. This was important. Children remembered the moments when adults met them at their height, rather than towering over them. "Your biological father died before you were born," she said, using the same gentle honesty she always used. "He was a good man. He loved me very much. He would have loved you more than anything in the world. But sometimes life is cruel, and we lose people we need." Marcus's lower lip trembled. He was 5, but he was also the son of one of the most powerful women in the criminal underworld. He had inherited her ability to process complex emotions without completely falling apart. "But why can't I have a new daddy?" he asked. "Like Javier has. His mommy got a new daddy for him last year." Javier was a boy in Marcus's kindergarten class, the son of a Venezuelan cartel lieutenant who had recently remarried after his first wife's assassination. The criminal underworld was full of reconstituted families. Isolde pulled Marcus close, breathing in the scent of his hair, still carrying traces of the coconut oil she used on it every morning. "Would you want a new father?" she asked carefully. "If I could find someone good? Someone who would love you and protect you and teach you how to be a man." Marcus nodded against her chest, and Isolde felt something break inside her. She had built an empire. She controlled supply chains that spanned 3 continents. She had negotiated with warlords and senators and cartel bosses. She had survived assassination attempts and corporate sabotage and investigations by 5 different law enforcement agencies. But she could not give her son the one thing he wanted most. That night, after Marcus fell asleep, Isolde sat in her office and made the hardest decision of her life. She opened her encrypted laptop and sent a message to her cousin Adeyemi in Lagos. "I need you to reach out to the Kane family. Tell them I'm open to discussing an alliance. Tell them I'm willing to consider marriage." She stared at the message for 10 minutes before hitting send. Once it was gone, she poured herself a glass of Nigerian palm wine and stood at her window, watching the ships in her harbor, and wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Cashin Kane arrived at Isolde's office wearing a suit that probably cost $12,000 and an expression that suggested he was doing her a favor by showing up. He was handsome in the way that men who have never been told no tend to be handsome, features arranged pleasantly, but with an underlying weakness in the jaw, a softness around the eyes that suggested he had never truly suffered. He looked at Isolde the way men like him always looked at women like her, with poorly concealed assessment, calculating whether her body met his standards, determining whether she was attractive enough to be seen with in public, measuring her worth based on how she would photograph on his arm. Isolde saw all of this in the first 3 seconds. She had been dealing with men like Cashin her entire life. But she smiled because this was a negotiation, and in negotiations you didn't start by showing your hand. "Mr. Kane," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for meeting with me." "Ms. Mercer," he replied, shaking her hand with the kind of firm grip men use when they're trying to establish dominance. "Or should I say Mrs. Soon-to-be Kane?" He laughed at his own joke. Isolde did not. "I wanted to meet you before we formalized any arrangements," she said, gesturing to the leather chairs in her office. "This alliance would bind our families together. I thought it was important we understand each other." Understand each other? Cashin settled into the chair with the casualness of someone who had never had to earn his place in any room. I think it's pretty straightforward. You need access to our distribution networks. We need access to your ports. Marriage is just the legal mechanism that makes the whole thing harder to dissolve. And my son? Isolde asked carefully. Cashin's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been distaste. But he recovered quickly. Of course, he said smoothly. The boy comes with the package. I understand that. I'm prepared to accommodate that reality. Accommodate. The word hung in the air like a bad smell. Marcus is not a reality to be accommodated, Isolde said, her voice hardening slightly. He is a child who needs a father figure. If we move forward with this arrangement, you would be stepping into that role. That means being present, being involved, being someone he can trust and rely on. Cashin waved his hand dismissively. Sure. I'll take him to baseball games or whatever. Buy him toys. Kids are easy. Isolde felt warning bells going off in her head, but she pushed them down. She needed this to work. Marcus needed this to work. Would you like to meet him? She asked. The kid? Now. He's in the next room with his tutor. I thought you might want to spend some time with him. Get to know him. Cashin glanced at his watch. A Patek Philippe that probably cost more than most people's cars. I guess I have 20 minutes. That should have been the moment Isolde called off the entire arrangement. But instead, she called Marcus into the office. Her son entered wearing his school uniform, a small blazer over a button-down shirt, tiny dress shoes that he had polished himself because she had taught him that a man should take pride in his appearance. His hair was freshly cut, shaped and lined perfectly. He looked at Cashin with the kind of open curiosity that 5-year-olds have before the world teaches them to be suspicious. Marcus, Isolde said gently, this is Mr. Kane. He's a friend of Mommy's. Hi, Marcus said, extending his small hand the way Isolde had taught him. Cashin looked at the hand for a moment too long before shaking it. Hey kid, are you going to be my new daddy? Marcus asked with the brutal honesty of childhood. Cashin's smile became strained. Something like that. Do you like ships? Marcus asked, his eyes lighting up. Mommy's ships are the biggest in the whole harbor. She let me name one. I called it Thunder because it sounds strong. That's great, Cashin said, already looking at his phone. Marcus, undeterred by the adult's disinterest, continued talking about ships and shipping routes and all the things his mother had taught him. Cashin made appropriate noises but was clearly not listening. When the 20 minutes were up, Cashin stood. Well, this has been educational. I'll see you at the engagement party, Isolde. And you too, kid. He left without shaking Marcus's hand again. Marcus looked up at his mother. Did I talk too much? He asked, his voice small. No, baby, Isolde said, pulling him close. You were perfect. You're always perfect. But in her chest something twisted. A warning. An intuition. The knowledge that she was making a terrible mistake. She ignored it. The morning of the wedding, Isolde woke at 4 a.m. She didn't sleep well anymore. She had been having dreams, not nightmares exactly, but unsettling visions of standing at an altar and watching it crumble beneath her feet. She went to Marcus's room and found him already awake, sitting in his bed, holding the stuffed lion that had been his comfort object since he was 2. Can't sleep? She asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. I'm excited, he said. But his voice carried a tremor that suggested excitement wasn't the only thing he was feeling. Today I get a daddy. Isolde pulled him into her lap. This beautiful child who had been her entire world for 5 years. And she felt the weight of what she was doing settle over her like a physical thing. Marcus, she said carefully, I need you to understand something. If at any point today, or any day after today, you feel uncomfortable or unsafe or unhappy, you tell me. Immediately. You understand? Your happiness matters more than any alliance, any deal, anything in the world. But you said this would make our family complete, Marcus said, looking up at her with those wide, trusting eyes. I thought it would, Isolde admitted. But if I'm wrong, we'll figure something else out. Okay. Marcus nodded, but Isolde could see he didn't truly understand. He was 5. He believed that adults knew what they were doing. He believed that his mother, who controlled an empire, would never make a mistake that could hurt him. The hours before the wedding were a blur of activity. Hair and makeup artists, tailors making final adjustments to Marcus's small white tuxedo, security teams doing sweeps of the ballroom, her family arriving from Lagos, aunts and uncles and cousins who looked at her with expressions that ranged from support to concern to outright disapproval. Her aunt Ngozi pulled her aside 2 hours before the ceremony. "You don't have to do this," the older woman said in Yoruba, their mother tongue. "I know you think you're giving Marcus something he needs, but children need authentic love, not performed obligation. Cashin will grow into the role," Isolde insisted, though even to her own ears it sounded unconvincing. "And if he doesn't?" Ngozi pressed. "Then I'll handle it," Isolde said. "I always do." 5-year-old Marcus Mercer stood at an altar in Miami's most prestigious ballroom, wearing a white tuxedo that had been tailored specifically for him. His shoes were so shiny he could see his own confused reflection in them. A small brown face looking back at him with an expression that was part excitement, part nervousness, part hope. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he understood the basics. Today was the day that would change his life forever. Today was the day he would get what he had been asking for since he could form sentences. Today was the day he would finally have a daddy like other kids had daddies. His mother stood beside him in a wedding dress that made her look like a queen. The ivory silk was custom designed by a Nigerian designer who had incorporated traditional Yoruba patterns into the bodice, intricate geometric shapes that told stories of her heritage, her strength, her lineage. Her hair was arranged in elaborate braids that had taken 4 hours to complete, woven with gold threads that caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above. She held his hand and he held hers back because that was the safest thing in the world to hold. The ballroom was massive, cathedral ceilings, marble floors that reflected light like water, windows 3 stories tall that looked out over Miami's waterfront. 800 people filled the space. Marcus recognized some of them from the parties his mother hosted. Serious men in expensive suits who kissed his mother's hand and called her Your Majesty, in ways that suggested it wasn't entirely a joke. Beautiful women who moved through rooms like they owned them, who spoke multiple languages and could negotiate deals that shifted millions of dollars with a single phone call. His mother had explained that these were family friends. Marcus didn't fully understand what that meant, but he understood that they were important, that they were powerful, that they were watching. The judge stood at the altar, a white man with gray hair and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile decades ago. His robes were black and expensive, and when he spoke, his voice echoed through the ballroom in a way that made Marcus think of church, though his mother had explained this wasn't exactly a church wedding. "We are gathered here today," the judge began, his words formal and heavy, "to bind 2 houses in matrimony, to create an alliance that will secure peace between the Mercer Syndicate and the Kane family." Marcus didn't understand all the words, but he understood the important part. His mother was getting married, and he was getting a father. He looked up at Cashin Kane, who stood on the other side of his mother. The man was tall, much taller than Marcus, taller than almost everyone in the room. He wore a suit that his mother had told Marcus cost more money than most people see in a year, though Marcus wasn't entirely sure what that meant. The suit was black and perfectly fitted, making Cashin look important and powerful. But there was something about Cashin's face that made Marcus uncomfortable. Something about the way his eyes moved around the room instead of looking at Marcus or his mother. Something about the way his jaw was clenched, like he was angry about something but trying to hide it. The judge continued. "More importantly, we are gathered to create a family structure that will provide stability and protection for all parties involved, including the minor child present at this ceremony." That was him. Marcus was the minor child. He squeezed his mother's hand and she squeezed back. Their secret signal that meant "I love you, you're safe, I'm here." The judge turned to Cashin. "Cashin Kane, do you take Isolde Mercer and her son Marcus to be your family, to provide for them, to protect them, to stand as father to the child and partner to the woman, until death or circumstance dictates otherwise?" The ballroom went silent. 800 people held their collective breath. Marcus held his mother's hand tighter, waiting for the words that would change everything. Waiting to hear the "I do" that would make this man his father. Waiting for his life to finally be complete. Cashin looked at Isolde. His eyes moved over her body in a way that made Marcus uncomfortable, though he didn't understand why. Then Cashin looked down at him, looked at Marcus's face, looked at his small hand holding his mother's hand, looked at the hope in his eyes, and his expression changed, hardened, became something cold and distant and cruel. I don't. 2 words. 2 words that hung in the air like a physical thing, like something you could reach out and touch, like poison gas spreading through the ballroom, like a knife suspended midair before it falls. For 3 seconds, Marcus would remember later that it was exactly 3 seconds, because he counted them in his head the way his mother had taught him to count when he was scared. 800 powerful people tried to process what they had just heard. The judge's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Isolde's hand tightened on Marcus's so hard it almost hurt. And Marcus tugged on his mother's dress, looking up at her face, trying to understand what had just happened. Mommy. His voice was small, confused, frightened. What does I don't mean? Isolde's throat closed. She tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to do something, anything, to protect her child from what was about to happen. But no words came out, because she knew. In that moment she knew exactly what was about to happen, and she was powerless to stop it. Cashin grabbed the microphone from the judge's hand with the confidence of a man who had never experienced real consequences for his actions. His face was flushed, not with embarrassment, but with the strange excitement of someone about to do something irreversible, something destructive, something that would hurt people and who was going to enjoy every second of it. Look at her, he said, his voice booming through the sound system, amplified and broadcast through live streams to thousands of people in the criminal underworld who were watching remotely. Look at what they sent me. He gestured at Isolde's body, his hand moving through the air in a sweeping motion that encompassed her from head to toe, the gesture itself an act of violence. I am a Kane, he continued, his voice rising. We are American royalty. We built the East Coast infrastructure when there was nothing but dirt roads and desperate immigrants. My great-grandfather established the first distribution networks during Prohibition. My grandfather consolidated power during the cocaine boom of the 80s. My father controls more territory than any other crime family south of New York. He paused for effect, looking around the room at 800 faces frozen in shock. And you expect me to marry this? He pointed at Isolde like she was an object in a store he was rejecting. You expect me to bind myself to someone who takes up this much space? Someone who looks like this? The words landed like blows. Marcus felt his mother's hand trembling in his, felt her body going rigid beside him. He looked up at her face and saw something he had never seen before. His mother, who was the strongest person in his entire world, who could face down gangsters and senators and rival crime lords without flinching, looked like she was breaking. But Cashin wasn't done. I was told I was marrying a queen, he continued, his words cutting through the ballroom like shards of glass. I was told I was marrying the heiress to the Gold Coast. I was told I was marrying a political asset, a strategic partner, someone who would photograph well on my arm, and give me credibility in the circles that matter. He turned to his father, Thaddeus Kane, whose face had gone completely blank. The older man sat in the front row, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles had turned white. Instead, Cashin said, his voice dripping with disgust, they sent me a woman who can't even control her own appetite, a woman whose body is an embarrassment, a woman who I would be ashamed to introduce to my associates. The gasps in the ballroom were audible now, even in the criminal underworld, a world built on violence and moral compromise. There were lines you didn't cross. Publicly humiliating a woman at her own wedding. Body-shaming someone in front of 800 witnesses. These were not things that powerful men did to powerful women, not if they wanted to continue being powerful men. But Cashin was beyond caring. He was drunk on his own righteousness, on his own sense of betrayal that he had been asked to marry someone who didn't meet his physical standards. And the child, he continued, and now his gaze landed on Marcus. Marcus felt those eyes on him like weights, like something physically pressing down on his small body. He tried to make himself smaller, tried to hide behind his mother's dress, but Cashin's words found him anyway. You expect me to pretend to care about someone else's bastard? Cashin's voice rose to a near shout. You expect me to be a father to a child who isn't even my blood? A child who I have no connection to? A child who is nothing but a reminder of his mother's poor choices. Marcus's brain, his 5-year-old brain that was still developing, still forming the neural pathways that would determine how he saw himself for the rest of his life, tried to process what was being said. He understood that bastard was a bad word, though he didn't fully understand what it meant. He understood that Cashin was saying mean things about him. He understood that the man who was supposed to become his father was looking at him with an expression that looked like hate. I was promised the best, Cashin said, his voice now carrying a tone of wounded entitlement. Instead they sent me baggage. Dead weight. A woman too fat to look respectable standing next to me, and a child too annoying to ignore. The word fat cut through Isolde like a physical blade. She had spent her entire life in a world that judged women's worth by their bodies. She had built an empire while simultaneously fighting against every assumption people made about her based on her size, her gender, her race. She had developed armor thick enough to deflect most insults. But hearing this man she had been willing to marry, this man she had allowed her son to hope would become his father, publicly degrade her body while her child listened? That armor cracked. Marcus's hand tightened on his mother's dress. The fabric crumpled in his small fist as his 5-year-old brain scrambled to make sense of what was happening. He pulled at her dress, his voice breaking. Mommy? Why is he saying mean things? Did I do something wrong? Is he mad because I talked too much about ships? Isolde knelt down immediately, still in her wedding dress, the ivory silk pooling around her on the cold marble floor. She pulled her son close to her chest, shielding his body with her own, wrapping her arms around him as though she could physically protect him from words that had already hit him, had already wounded something inside him that would take years to heal. No, baby, she whispered, her voice steady despite the fact that she was breaking internally. You did nothing wrong. You are perfect. You are wanted. You are loved. She held him tighter, trying to pour all her love into the embrace, trying to undo in this moment what Cashin had just done. But she knew, every parent knows, that some wounds can't be healed with hugs and reassurances. Some wounds go deeper. Some wounds reshape how a child sees themselves. She stood up, still holding Marcus, and walked to the microphone with the same purposeful stride she used when she walked through her port facilities, when she walked into negotiations, when she walked into rooms where people were betting their lives on her ability to keep them safe. She took the microphone from Cashin's hand with such absolute certainty that he didn't even try to resist. He simply let go, his expression shifting from righteous anger to confusion as he realized that the woman he had just humiliated was about to speak. Isolde's voice, when she spoke, carried through the ballroom with the weight of 3 generations of West African queens who had ruled kingdoms before colonial powers had even discovered the continent existed. You have made your choice, she said, her words clear and unwavering. You have rejected me. That is your absolute right. I have no quarrel with that. You are not the first man to look at a woman who didn't fit his aesthetic preferences and decide she wasn't worth his time. You won't be the last. She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd. 800 people watched in absolute silence as the woman who had just been publicly humiliated refused to be diminished. But understand this, she continued, and now her voice grew harder, colder, more dangerous. You didn't just reject a woman. You rejected a 5-year-old child who believed you were going to be his father. She raised Marcus to her hip, letting the entire ballroom, letting the thousands watching via live stream, see her son's confused, hurt face. See the tears that were starting to form in his eyes. See the exact moment a child's heart was breaking. You looked at his hope and you crushed it like it meant nothing, Isolde continued. You promised this boy that you would be his family, and then you decided his worth was determined by how he looked, by whose blood runs through his veins, by whether or not you found him convenient. Her eyes swept across the ballroom, making contact with judges, senators, crime lords, businessmen. All the men who had made their fortunes in the gray spaces between legal and illegal. All the men who understood that reputation was everything in their world. This child, Isolde said, her voice now carrying the full weight of a mother's fury, is worth more than every member of your family combined. He is intelligent. He is kind. He is loyal. He is exactly what a father should want in a son. She turned her gaze back to Cashin, and her expression was something between disappointment and absolute certainty. "The Mercer ports are now closed to the Kane family," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the massive ballroom. "Effective immediately. Every route, every facility, every connection. Closed." She let that sink in. In the criminal underworld, ports were everything. They were how you moved product, how you imported weapons, how you exported money, how you maintained your territory. Isolde Mercer controlled more port infrastructure than anyone else on the eastern seaboard. Losing access to her facilities meant the Kanes would have to completely restructure their entire operation. "If a Kane ship enters my waters," she continued, her voice now carrying the tone of a queen issuing a decree, "it sinks. If a Kane operative sets foot in Lagos, they disappear. If anyone associated with Cashin Kane or his family tries to conduct business in territories I control, they will discover what happens when you cross a mother protecting her child." She dropped the microphone. It clattered to the floor, the sound amplified and echoing through the ballroom like a gavel striking wood, like a door slamming shut, like the sound of an empire fracturing. She turned to walk away, carrying her son, her dress trailing behind her like storm clouds, her family, dozens of Nigerian relatives who had traveled across an ocean to witness what was supposed to be a unifying marriage, rising from their seats to follow her out. Marcus was crying now, his face buried in his mother's shoulder, his small body shaking with sobs. He still didn't fully understand what had happened, but he understood enough. The father he was supposed to get was gone. The family he was supposed to have was not going to happen. His mother's sacrifice had been for nothing. And somewhere deep in his 5-year-old brain, a neural pathway was forming. A belief. A truth that would take years to undo. "I am not wanted. I am not good enough. There is something wrong with me." The doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. But not for Isolde to leave. For someone else to enter. The doors didn't open gently. Didn't swing open with the careful control of ballroom staff managing an event. They burst open with the force of a statement. With the force of a man who was announcing his arrival not through words but through the sheer physical presence of his entry. It wasn't the police. 800 people in that room would have recognized police the way prey animals recognize predators. Their entire infrastructure was built around detecting law enforcement. It wasn't security. The ballroom had its own security teams. Private military contractors being paid 6 figures to ensure no one interrupted the ceremony. This was not part of that infrastructure. It was a private army. 50 men in black suits entered through the doors in perfect formation. Each suit was tailored to perfection, not off the rack but custom-fitted to emphasize shoulders, to project power, to communicate that these were not ordinary security personnel. Each man moved with the precision of military training, the kind of discipline that came from years of following orders without question. Each man wore a silver lapel pin that depicted a dragon coiled around a sword. The Voss Syndicate. The Gang P. The organized crime network that controlled the shadows of 3 continents. That moved in darkness and disappeared before anyone knew it had ever been there. That was whispered about in the underworld, the way children whisper about monsters under the bed. The air in the ballroom shifted. The temperature seemed to drop. The energy that had been building, the shock of the rejection, the anger of the Mercer family, the calculations of every crime lord in the room about what this meant for the balance of power, all of it suddenly became secondary. Something worse had entered the room. Something more dangerous. Walking at the front of the phalanx was Kale Voss, the Dragon of Busan. He was tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of lean muscle that came from decades of discipline rather than vanity. Not the bulky gym muscle of men trying to look impressive, but the efficient, dangerous muscle of someone who had spent years learning how to kill people efficiently. His skin was pale, almost luminescent under the crystal chandeliers, as though he had spent his entire life in darkness and his body had adapted to the absence of light. His hair was ink black and swept back from his face, revealing features that looked like they had been carved by someone with a dangerous aesthetic vision. High cheekbones, a jawline that could cut glass, eyes so dark they looked black, but when the light hit them just right, they reflected like obsidian. Cold, ancient, revealing nothing of what was happening behind them. A thin white scar ran through his left eyebrow, cutting through the perfect symmetry of his face. the only imperfection on features that otherwise looked like they belonged in a museum as a sculpture of controlled violence. The scar was old, probably decades old, the kind that came from a blade rather than an accident. He wore a suit that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Black on black on black. A shirt of silk so fine it looked like water when it moved. No tie. Ties were for men who needed to project authority they didn't naturally possess. Kale Voss didn't need a tie. The only jewelry he wore was a single platinum ring on his left hand, crested with a black onyx dragon that seemed to catch the light and throw it back, as though the ring itself was glowing from some internal source. He didn't walk down the aisle like a guest arriving at a wedding. He walked like he owned the space. Like every square inch of marble and every breath of air in this ballroom belonged to him, and everyone in it was simply occupying space he had allowed them to occupy. Crime lords moved out of his path without being asked. Senators who had been bought and paid for by a dozen different criminal organizations suddenly found themselves stepping aside without conscious thought. Even Thaddeus Kane, a man who controlled half the eastern seaboard's criminal infrastructure, seemed to shrink slightly in his seat as Kale Voss passed. But when Kale reached the center of the ballroom, when he was standing in clear view of Isolde and Marcus and the shocked faces of 800 crime lords, he did something that no one expected. He didn't approach Isolde. He didn't confront Cassian. He didn't make threats or issue demands or do any of the things that powerful men in the underworld did when they entered a room where power dynamics had just shifted. He approached Marcus. He walked directly to the 5-year-old child who was still crying in his mother's arms, who was still trying to understand why the man who was supposed to become his father had rejected him in front of the entire world. And he knelt. He knelt to the child's eye level. The entire ballroom gasped. This was unprecedented. This was unheard of. In the underworld, power never knelt. Strength never lowered itself. Dominance never submitted to anything or anyone. The hierarchy was established and maintained through the careful performance of physical and psychological advantage. Yet here was Kale Voss, a man whose very name was whispered as a warning, a man responsible for hundreds of deaths, a man who had built an empire on the understanding that mercy was a luxury only the weak allowed themselves, a man who controlled operations that moved billions of dollars through channels that governments couldn't even detect. Here was this man on one knee, meeting the eyes of a 5-year-old child. Kale didn't speak immediately. He simply looked at Marcus. He looked at the child's tear-stained face. He looked at the confusion in the boy's eyes. He looked at the small hand that was still gripping his mother's dress. He looked at the moment a child's world was breaking apart, and he understood something fundamental that most people never grasp. This moment would define the child for the rest of his life. "Hello," Kale said. His voice was low, rough like gravel moving under a tide, but carrying an undertone of absolute authority. "What is your name?" Marcus hesitated. He looked up at his mother, as though asking permission to speak to this dangerous stranger. There was something instinctively protective in that glance. A 5-year-old recognizing that his mother was in the presence of something potentially dangerous, something that existed outside the normal rules of the world. Isolde nodded, and in that nod was the release of control. She was giving her son permission to engage with a man who was, by any objective measure, far more dangerous than Cassian Kane could ever be. But she also recognized something in Kale Voss that she hadn't recognized in Cassian Kane: respect. The way his eyes moved when he looked at her son wasn't calculating or dismissive. It was observant. It was seeing. "Marcus," the child said, his voice small, uncertain. "My name is Marcus." Kale tilted his head slightly, studying the boy with the same intensity he probably brought to studying his enemies before destroying them. The gesture was paternal in a way that seemed impossible for a man of his reputation. "Marcus," he repeated, as though committing the name to memory, as though it mattered. "That is a strong name. Do you know what it means?" Marcus shook his head, his small voice barely audible in the suddenly silent ballroom. "It comes from Mars," Kale said, "the god of war in ancient mythology. It is the name of warriors. It is the name of men who are strong. Men who stand when others fall. Men who protect what they love." He paused, letting Marcus process this information. Around them, 800 people watched in stunned silence as a man known for extreme violence spoke gently to a frightened child. It was surreal. It was unprecedented. It was the moment the entire criminal underworld began to understand that something fundamental had shifted. Your mother is the most powerful woman I have ever met, Kale continued, his eyes never leaving the child's face. I have been watching her run the Atlantic ports for 3 years. I have watched her break men who tried to cheat her. I have watched her navigate the most complex criminal infrastructure on the East Coast without making a single mistake. I have watched her build an empire that moves billions of dollars without leaving a trace that any government agency has ever been able to follow. He shifted slightly, settling into a more comfortable kneeling position, as though he was prepared to stay at this child's eye level for as long as it took. The intensity of his focus on Marcus was absolute, unwavering. Every adult in the ballroom understood that they were witnessing something significant. A man choosing deliberately and consciously to humble himself before a child. That man, Kale said, gesturing at Cashin without taking his eyes off Marcus, made the biggest mistake of his life. He promised your mother that he would be your father. He promised that he would step into the role that has been empty since before you were born. He promised that he would protect you, teach you, guide you through becoming a man. Marcus's lip began to tremble. The child's small frame seemed to tremble with the weight of trying to understand something that no 5-year-old should have to process. The rejection had shattered something inside him, and now this dangerous stranger was confirming what his child brain was beginning to understand: that the man had chosen not to love him. And then, Kale continued, his voice gentle but carrying an undertone of absolute certainty, he decided he didn't want to. He decided that his own comfort, his own preferences, his own disgust was more important than a promise he made to you. He looked at you and he saw something to reject instead of something to cherish. Kale leaned slightly forward, his dark eyes locked with the child's tear-filled eyes. I cannot replace him, he said. I did not know you yesterday. I cannot claim to have been part of your life before this moment. I cannot offer you years of history, of memories, of the kind of relationship that develops over time. He paused, letting this truth settle. The honesty of it was striking. He wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. He wasn't making false promises or constructing an elaborate fantasy. He was being truthful with a 5-year-old child about his limitations. But I can offer you something else, he said. I can offer you the choice to allow me to become your father. Not to replace the father you've never had, but to fill that space with something real, something present, something that is chosen rather than inherited. Something that begins right now and continues for the rest of our lives. He extended his hand toward Marcus, palm up, an offering that was part question and part promise. His hand was steady. His eyes were unwavering. He was completely present in this moment with a 5-year-old child, and every person in the ballroom understood that this man was making a commitment more binding than any business contract could ever be. Would you allow me to be the father he refused to be? The ballroom was completely silent. No one breathed. No one moved. 800 people watched as a 5-year-old child decided the fate of an empire. The fate of 3 lives. The future of the entire underworld balance of power. Marcus looked at his mother. Isolde had tears streaming down her face now. Not tears of sadness but tears of something else. Relief perhaps. Or recognition. She saw in Kale Voss something she hadn't expected to find. A man who understood what it meant to choose family. A man who understood that love wasn't something inherited, but something consciously committed to. She nodded, and in that nod was the release of all her fear, all her sacrifice, all her hope that somehow this moment could be redemption. In that nod was her permission for her son to choose this dangerous man over the safety of uncertainty. The 5-year-old looked back at Kale. And he took the man's hand. Okay, Marcus said, his small voice carrying a certainty that seemed impossible for a child his age. Okay, I want you to be my daddy. Kale closed his eyes for just a moment, as though letting this affirmation sink into him. As though understanding the weight of what had just been given to him. As though recognizing that this moment, this choice by a 5-year-old child, had fundamentally altered the trajectory of his existence. Then he opened them and stood up, Marcus's hand in his, and he extended his other hand to Isolde. She took it without hesitation. The 3 of them stood together at the altar, a woman whose sacrifice had just been redeemed, a child who had been abandoned and then chosen, and a man who had looked at an impossible situation and decided that love mattered more than the careful calculations of power and strategy. The judge stood frozen, his ceremonial book still in his hands, his mouth open slightly. He looked at Cale Voss, then at Isolde Mercer, then back at Cassian Kane, trying to process what was happening and whether it was within his authority to continue. Cale turned to him, and the force of his gaze was enough. The judge didn't need words. He didn't need threats. He simply understood, on a level deeper than conscious thought, that continuing the ceremony was no longer optional. It was inevitable. "Say the words," Cale said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Complete the ceremony. Bind us as family. Or leave this building and never speak of what you have witnessed here. You have 30 seconds to decide." The judge looked at Cassian, as though hoping for some kind of intervention, some kind of authority that might override this man who had just entered with 50 soldiers. There was no intervention coming. Cassian's face had gone completely white. His father, Thaddeus Kane, had begun to stand as though about to physically intervene, but one of the Voss soldiers, a massive man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, stepped toward him with a subtle movement that communicated everything that needed to be communicated. The judge began to speak. His voice trembled as he recited the vows. He spoke the words that would bind Cale to Isolde. He spoke the words that would acknowledge Marcus as Cale's son, that would create a legal family structure that transcended the biological accident of birth. When the judge reached the final blessing, Cale did something that would be replayed millions of times in the months and years to come. He knelt down to Marcus's level again. "Marcus," Cale said, speaking to the child with the same respect he probably reserved for the most powerful figures in the underworld. "Your mother is now my wife. I am her husband. And you are now my son." He paused, making sure the child understood the weight of what he was saying. "In my culture, this is a sacred bond," Cale continued. "It means I will protect you with my life. It means you are no longer alone. It means you have a family. It means you have a father who chose you, who will always choose you, who will never abandon you, no matter what happens in the world around us." He stood up and extended his hand to Marcus. "Would you like to walk out of this ballroom with me and your mother? To begin our life together? To become the family that we are now?" Marcus took his hand without hesitation. The three of them walked down the aisle together, hand in hand, while 800 crime lords, senators, judges, and businesspeople watched the world shift on its axis. As they passed Thaddeus Kane, the old man's face had gone ashen. As they passed Cassian, the young man was shaking slightly, as though only now beginning to understand what he had done. The Voss citadel was unlike anything Isolde and Marcus had ever seen. It was both a fortress and a palace, brutalist architecture designed to communicate that the people within were beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement, conventional weapons, conventional threats. The exterior was concrete and steel, no windows on the lower levels, security systems so sophisticated they could track a single person moving through the building from any angle. The interior was designed differently. Traditional Korean aesthetics mixed with modern technology, sliding doors and paper screens creating semi-private spaces that could be reconfigured depending on need. But on the third floor, in what had been a weapons storage facility, construction crews were already working when they arrived. Cale had apparently made calls from the car on the drive from Miami to Miami, and by the time they stepped out of the elevator, dozens of workers were already dismantling walls and rebuilding them. "I had this planned," Cale said to Isolde, a slight smile on his face, the first genuine expression of happiness she had seen from him. "Not for this situation specifically, but I had considered the possibility." He knelt to Marcus's level. "What do you think, Marcus? Should we make your room blue? Or green? Or perhaps both?" Marcus looked around at the construction workers, at the blueprints spread across surfaces, at the possibility that was being created before his eyes. And for the first time since the altar, a small smile appeared on his face. "Can it have windows?" he asked. "Big windows where I can see the city?" "Any windows you want," Cale said. "As big as you want. As many as you want." Over the next week, Marcus's room transformed. The walls were painted in soft blues and greens that evoked calm and safety. The lighting was designed by specialists who understood the psychology of children's spaces. Warm, gentle, adjustable based on time of day. Toys were arranged so that small hands could reach them easily. Windows were reinforced so they couldn't be opened by a child, but remained beautiful, allowing him to see the city below without creating a vulnerability. Security measures were incorporated so seamlessly that Marcus didn't notice them. Cameras that looked like air vents. Reinforced walls that looked like decoration. Door locks that could only be opened from the outside. Designed not to trap the child but to ensure that no one could enter without authorization. On Marcus's first night in the penthouse, Kale sat with him for hours. Not doing anything in particular. Not teaching him anything or training him or trying to accomplish any goal. Simply being present. Kale positioned himself so that Marcus could lean against his chest, could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, could be reassured by the physical presence of a man who had promised he would never leave. The penthouse was quiet. Outside the windows, the city shifted from daylight to darkness. The lights of the city below began to glow as night fell. Inside, a man who had spent his entire adult life in shadows sat with a 5-year-old child and offered something that violence never could. Consistency. Safety. The quiet knowledge that someone was there and would remain there. Marcus asked questions that a 5-year-old asks when his world has suddenly been completely reorganized. "Will you still be here in the morning?" the child asked, his voice carrying the weight of abandonment anxiety that had been developing in him even before today's rejection. "Yes," Kale answered. "I will be here in the morning and every morning after that. I will be here when you wake up. I will be here to make sure you have breakfast. I will be here to walk you to school. I will be here. What if you get scared and want to go away?" Marcus asked, his small voice carrying the deepest fear of a child who had just been rejected. "I will not go away," Kale said. "No matter what happens. No matter how hard things become. I have made a promise to you, and I will keep that promise for the rest of my life. That is what fathers do. That is what I will do." "Why did you choose me?" Marcus asked. "You don't even know me." Kale was silent for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Hours passed as the man who had built an empire on violence and strategy sat with a child and thought about love and choice and the things that actually mattered. "Because when I looked at you," Kale finally said, "I saw a child who deserved to have someone choose him. I saw a moment where I could do something that mattered. I saw the opportunity to build something real instead of just accumulate power." He paused, choosing his next words with the precision he brought to every significant moment. "And because," he continued, "I was once that child. Abandoned. Alone. Waiting for someone to choose me. For someone to say, 'You matter.' That never happened for me. But I could make it happen for you. I could be for you what I needed someone to be for me." Marcus fell asleep against Kale's chest that night, his small hand holding the fabric of Kale's shirt, as though making sure that the man he had just chosen as his father wouldn't disappear in the darkness. Kale didn't move. He sat there through the entire night, watching his new son sleep, understanding that he had just made a choice that would reshape everything. In his office at Kane headquarters across the city, Thaddeus Kane was beginning to understand the magnitude of his son's mistake. Within hours of the wedding, the Mercer ports began to close. Not dramatically, not through any obvious action, but systematically, methodically, with the precision of someone who had planned for this contingency and was simply executing a predetermined strategy. His phone began to ring. Each call delivered the same message. Infrastructure that had taken decades to build was systematically being dismantled. A contact at the Port Authority. "Your shipments have been rerouted. All of them. The paperwork is being held up in administrative review. I don't have authority to override it. I would need direct approval from the Mercer organization, and they're not taking calls from Kane representatives. A distributor in New York. I can't move your product. The routes are sealed. It's like someone cut off every exit simultaneously. I don't know how this was coordinated so quickly. A shipping captain. We're being turned away from every port. It's like someone sent out a message to every facility in the hemisphere. We're not welcome. We're not allowed. It's over." Thaddeus sat in his office, a room that had once felt like the center of power, now feeling increasingly like a tomb. He understood what had happened. He understood that rejecting an alliance with the Mercers meant losing access to the ports that his entire operation depended on. He understood that the Voss Syndicate had just formalized an alliance with the Mercers, and that the combination of the two organizations made the Kane suddenly obsolete. He understood that his son had just destroyed everything he had spent 50 years building. And unlike Cashin, who was still making phone calls and screaming at subordinates and pretending the situation could be salvaged, Thaddeus simply sat in his office and understood that this was the end. It happened on a Tuesday evening 6 months after the wedding. The phone call came to Cale's office. Ryden, his lieutenant, was on the other end, and his voice carried an undertone of controlled panic. "We have a situation," Ryden said, using the code phrase that meant something catastrophic had occurred. "Marcus?" Cale asked immediately. The fact that this was his first question showed how completely his priorities had shifted. 6 months ago, he would have asked about the operation, about the casualties, about the threat assessment. Now he asked about his son. "Taken," Ryden confirmed. 30 minutes ago. Warehouse in the industrial district. Security footage shows 4 men. Professional job, but not Voss, not Mercer, not any of the families we've established relationships with. Cale understood immediately. Thaddeus Kane had made a move born from desperation, from the understanding that he had nothing left to lose. He had decided to take the one thing that Cale had chosen to protect with his life. He hung up the phone and went to find Isolde. She was in the war room looking at shipping manifests when he entered. One look at his face told her everything. "Marcus," she said, not a question but a statement. Her immediate understanding of what had happened showed the connection between the two of them. They had become a unit. "The Kanes," Cale confirmed. "Thaddeus is making his final play." Isolde didn't hesitate. She didn't panic. She moved with the same purposefulness she brought to everything in her life. "Your people are already moving?" she asked. "Yes," Cale confirmed. "But slowly. He'll execute the child if we move too fast." "Then we move differently," Isolde said. "We don't use force. We use strategy." Together, they planned a response that was pure intelligence and logistics. Isolde contacted the Port Authority. She had them seal the warehouses at a management level. She had them lock down the water routes. She had them ensure that no vehicle with a child could leave the district without official authorization. Cale worked with Ryden to monitor the warehouse. They tracked Thaddeus's movements. They anticipated his escape routes. They positioned people strategically, not to assault but to observe and contain. When they entered the warehouse, they walked in as parents retrieving their son. No soldiers visible. No weapons drawn. Just 2 people who had made a choice about what mattered most. Thaddeus was there with Marcus, the child tied to a chair but unharmed. Thaddeus looked diminished somehow. His face was gray. His hands shook slightly. He looked like a man who had been making calculations for months and had finally arrived at the conclusion that he had nothing left. "You made a mistake," Thaddeus said, his voice lacking any of the certainty it had possessed at the wedding. "You took my son's future. You closed my ports. You destroyed everything I built. This is the only move I have left." "Release the child," Isolde said, her voice carrying absolute authority. "And I will give you a choice. You can disappear. You can take whatever money you have left, you can reconstruct your life somewhere else on the planet, and you can live out your remaining years in peace." "And if I don't?" Thaddeus asked. "Then you will discover what happens when you threaten the child of a Voss-Mercer family," Isolde said. "And I promise you, death would be merciful compared to the alternative." Thaddeus looked at Cale, hoping for some indication of weakness, some opportunity for negotiation. Cale simply met his eyes. In that single look, Thaddeus understood everything. He understood that this man would do whatever was necessary to protect the child. He understood that his threats were irrelevant. He understood that his last card had been played and it had already lost. He released Marcus. Cale walked to the child, knelt to Marcus's level, and began to untie the bonds. "Marcus," Cale said, his voice steady and certain. "It's me. It's your father. You are safe now. I have you. You are safe." Marcus ran to him, crying and shaking, and Cale held him like he would never let him go. Isolde wrapped around both of them, mother and father and child, unified in the way families become unified when they have been tested and not found wanting. 1 year after the warehouse, the shape of the underworld had shifted completely. The Kane family effectively ceased to exist. Thaddeus disappeared, as Isolde had offered him the opportunity to do. He didn't resurface in any city, any port, any criminal enterprise. He simply vanished as though he had never been. Cashin lasted longer, but eventually made the same choice his father had. He left the country, leaving behind everything he had ever known, understanding that his name was now a liability rather than an asset. The Voss-Mercer alliance consolidated power across 3 continents. But the most significant change wasn't in the criminal hierarchy, or the balance of power, or the control of shipping routes and distribution networks. The most significant change was in a 5-year-old boy who learned over months that there were men in the world who would choose you, who would protect you, who would build their entire lives around ensuring your safety and happiness. Marcus Mercer Voss, they had given him both names, honoring his heritage and his new family, was growing up in an empire. But more importantly, he was growing up loved. Isolde had hired tutors to teach him not about power or strategy or the criminal underworld, but about history and language and mathematics and art. She wanted him to understand the world before he decided what role he wanted to play in it. Cale had designed a physical training program that was rigorous but joyful, that taught Marcus about discipline and strength, but also about the joy of physical movement and the confidence that came from understanding his own body. Together, they were raising a child who would be neither sheltered from the reality of his parents' world nor corrupted by it. A child who would inherit not just an empire but a philosophy about what that empire should be used for. On Marcus's 7th birthday, Cale and Isolde threw a party in the gardens overlooking the port of Lagos. The most dangerous crime families in the world attended. Crime lords from every continent. Ruthless businessmen who had built empires on violence and betrayal. Judges and politicians and people who had accumulated power through whatever means necessary. They all came to watch a 7-year-old boy open presents while his parents stood nearby, ensuring that he was protected from the darkness they inhabited. Cale stood back, observing the scene with something approaching satisfaction. A year ago, he had been a man without purpose beyond the accumulation of power. He had built an empire because that was what men like him did. He had developed a reputation for ruthlessness because that was how you survived in the world he inhabited. But standing in this garden, watching his son play with toys while his wife laughed at something one of her business associates had said, Cale understood that he had been wrong about something fundamental. Power without purpose was just violence with better marketing. But power used to protect something innocent, something precious, something worth dying for, that was something else entirely. That was legacy. They called it Throne of Blood and Ash, because that's what empires built in the underworld are made of. Blood, because violence is the foundation upon which criminal enterprises are constructed. Blood because men have died to build what Cale and Isolde controlled. Blood because the infrastructure of their power was maintained through the willingness to do things that civilized society would never acknowledge. Ash because everything built on violence eventually turns to ash. Because empires collapse. Because the men who build them eventually fall away, and are forgotten except in the stories that people tell about them. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand unless they were living it, was that this particular throne had a different foundation than most. It wasn't built solely on the suffering of others. It wasn't built by men pursuing abstract concepts like power, or territory, or influence. It was built by a woman and a man for a child. Isolde Mercer had sacrificed her happiness trying to give her son a normal life. She had been willing to marry a man she didn't love, to bind herself to a family that repulsed her, to trade pieces of herself for the chance to give her child what she thought she couldn't give him alone. A father figure, a family structure, a sense of belonging. She had allowed hope to override the strategic calculations that normally governed her life. And then, in the moment that should have been her greatest defeat, she had found something she hadn't anticipated. She had found a man who understood what it meant to choose family over everything else. Cale Voss had spent his entire adult life in the shadows. He had built an empire through violence and intelligence, and the absolute understanding that mercy was a luxury the underworld could not afford. He had become a legend not through his business acumen, but through his willingness to eliminate problems through whatever means necessary. He had learned to operate without feeling, without connection, without the kinds of emotional attachments that made people vulnerable. And then he had looked at a 5-year-old child at an altar and realized that everything he had learned about power was wrong. True power wasn't about dominance. True power was about protection. True power wasn't about making people fear you. True power was about making those you loved feel safe. Marcus Mercervas had been born in abandonment. His biological father had died before he was born, leaving him with nothing but stories from people who grieved the man he would never know. His first rejection had come at an altar, in front of 800 people, from a man who had promised to be his father and then looked at him with disgust. His childhood should have been shaped by these abandonments, by the understanding that men who promised to be there left or rejected or failed to show up at all. But instead he was being raised by a man who had chosen him, who had knelt to his level and asked if he could be his father, who had walked away from the careful calculations of strategic alliance to build a family. Marcus would grow up knowing something that many children never learned, that you could be chosen. That love wasn't something you had to earn or deserve. That family was something you could build with anyone willing to stand beside you. As Isolde and Kale stood on their balcony overlooking the empire they had built, watching their son sleep peacefully between them, they both understood something that the underworld would never fully comprehend. The throne they had built wasn't made of blood and ash like other empires. It was made of choice. It was made of a moment at an altar where a man decided that protecting an innocent child mattered more than strategic alliance, more than business advantage, more than the careful calculations that governed every other decision he made. It was made of a woman's sacrifice transformed into a mother's joy. It was made of a child who would grow up knowing he was chosen, loved, protected, worth dying for.